President Awad, members of the President Cabinet, esteemed faculty members and colleagues, distinguished guests, good evening. On behalf of the American University of Kuwait, I would like to welcome you all to the first lecture of the Faculty Speaker Series. The aim of the series is to showcase faculty expertise and to provide a platform for university community dialogue and debate. It will give everyone the opportunity to take part in the AUK experience. Before we start, I would like to thank our President, Dr. Rauda Awad, for her leadership, extreme dedication, and continued support. President Awad strongly believes that faculty's research and intellectual contributions are central to teaching excellence and service to the profession. I would also like to thank Dr. Salim Ismadi, co-chair of the Faculty Speaker Series, Ms. Bati Madana, the director for the Center for Teaching Excellence, for working so hard to organize this event. Our appreciation also goes to the IT and PR departments for providing the support to make this event happen. Our inaugural speaker, Dr. Katherine Hennessey, joined AUK in 2017 as an assistant professor of English. Her research on the socio-political significance of Yemen and Gulf theater and film has been published in academic journals, including Arab Stages, Arab Lit, Arabian Humanities, the Arab Journal of Performance Studies, and Middle East Report. She has a particular interest in contemporary adaptations of Shakespeare. She is the author of Shakespeare on the Arabian Peninsula, co-editor of Shakespeare and the Arab World, and director of the short film Shakespeare in Yemen. She also translates works of Arab theater such as Wajdi al-Ahdal, The Colonel's Wedding, into English. Her current book project, Theater on the Arabian Peninsula, was awarded a year-long research fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's a very competitive grant with only around an 8% success rate for applications. In 2018, she was one of 2 researchers only who have received this grant outside of the United States. Dr. Hennessey, the floor is yours.
Thank you all very much. My deepest thanks to Fatma Shibli and Salim Asmadi for organizing the AUK Faculty Lecture Series. I am honored to be asked to inaugurate this series, and I would like to give a warm welcome to all of you who are in attendance and to wish a Ramadan Kareem to those of you who are celebrating. Now, being the inaugural speaker also means that I'm a bit of a guinea pig, right? So we will see if the technology that I'm going to be using for this presentation actually functions as it should. I am hoping that IT will be on standby in the case of any glitches, but by the time I get through this, and we move on to our next speaker in the series, Dr. Ghulam, whose presentation I look forward to with great interest, I'm sure that we will have all of the, we will have figured out all of the technology requirements. So I am here today to talk to you about theater on the Arabian Peninsula. And let me actually begin by sharing my screen with you, and let's confirm that in fact, you can all see this, right?
Yes, we can see it. Yes, we can see it.
Fantastic. All right. So I should note in terms of my background, for those of you who aren't familiar, my formal intellectual training actually focused on theater from Western traditions. It wasn't until after graduate school, when I moved to Palestine and then Yemen, that I began to engage with theater from the Arab world. But when I did, I was quite struck by the degree to which socio-political content and critique and discussion of provocative issues could be found on the stage, even in contexts that were otherwise quite heavily censored. So, as Dr. Fatima mentioned, I am a professor of literature with a focus on Shakespeare, and I have always loved theater for many reasons, one of which is that in the theater, the audience is important. As any actor can tell you, the reactions of the audience affect the performance. If the audience laughs or applauds or gets bored and starts scrolling through their cell phones or leaves halfway through, that can actually affect the performance itself. And more, those reactions actually become part of the performance. To put it another way, the creation of meaning in the theater is a communal act in which the actors, the director, the crew, and all of the audience members participate. Now, I must say that to talk about theater in the current context, as we're still weathering the COVID pandemic, feels a bit like an exercise in nostalgia. So many theaters have closed, so many performances have been postponed or canceled, or they've moved to virtual media, which is good, but it is not the same as being there in person, experiencing a live performance. But of course, theater faced some significant challenges even before the pandemic. As you can see from the title of this New York Times article from 2019, there is a prevailing prejudice in some quarters that theater is the province of neurotic narcissists who aren't quite talented enough to make it in film or television. Now, I should say that the New York Times, of course, asks this as a question, and the answer that Jesse Green comes to at the end of this article is a very definite no, theater is not ridiculous. And of course, the New York Times itself devotes an incredible amount of energy and resources to performance reviews, coverage of theater news, not just in New York City, but across the United States. If we turn to the Arabian Gulf, though, I would say theater tends to be conspicuously absent from discussions of culture. And I'll just give you one salient example, a conference that ran just recently, organized by the Sorbonne Abu Dhabi and NYU Abu Dhabi. Fantastic conference, wonderful speakers. But I must point out that of the 34 presentations delivered under the title of Culture Made in Arabia, the topics covered ranged from the novel, short stories, poetry, the music industry, literary magazines, academic conferences, publishing venues, men's and women's fashion, film and television, and social media. Not a single one discussed theater. I'm here today to suggest to you that theater is a genre to which we should be paying some attention for its incisive ability to comment on contemporary socio-political issues, to evade the strictures of censorship, and above all, for its ability to create and to model new forms of community and communal interaction. I'm going to provide you with 3 examples, and my first one is this. A play called Asarabia, or 4 o'clock, in a script by Talal Mahmoud, directed by Ibrahim Saleh, and performed by the Sharjah Modern Theatre Troupe as part of the Sharjah Theatre Days Festival in 2019. All right, now here comes the tricky part, because I'm going to have to switch back and forth between my PowerPoint presentation and this video. Fingers crossed that will work. But so you'll understand what is happening in the video, let me tell you first that in this work of theater, we find 5 characters, all of whom suffer from different forms of obsessive compulsive disorder, who convene in their therapist's waiting room for an appointment that is supposed to start at 4 o'clock, but their therapist is not there. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you see Jalil, who suffers from verification disorder, right? He's constantly checking that he has his keys, that he turned off his stove, that he's closed the faucet. And he does this repeatedly, dozens and dozens of times. He's never quite sure. We have Sammy, a young man who suffers from a phobia of irregular patterns, which makes it difficult for him to walk on normal surfaces. And he spends most of the play jumping from one piece of furniture to the next rather than stepping on the floor. We have Lara in the middle, who's a nosophobe. She has a fear of germs and disease, and she is constantly compulsively washing her hands and sanitizing everything around her, which probably sounds familiar to all of us at this point. Fuad has Tourette's syndrome, and his inadvertent blurting out of obscenities provides a lot of the comedy in the play. And Manal on the end here suffers from echolalia. She compulsively repeats herself. She can't say anything just once. She has to repeat it several times. As they wait in their therapist's office, they begin to reveal to each other the struggles that each of them has had with OCD. And their interactions turn into a form of therapy. They become a support group, if you like. So at this point, let me actually show you, inshallah, a short video from this performance. Okay, can all of you see the video?
No.
No, it's not visible.
Okay, give me just a second. As I said, the technology. How about now?
Yeah, now, yeah.
Yeah, it's coming.
Okay, excellent. So I'll start this from the beginning. What you're going to see is not one continuous scene, it's a compilation. So little bits of scenes from this play. In particular, we're going to be focusing on two characters, Jalil, who is Muslim, and Lara, who is Christian. And you will see that is important in terms of our understanding of what's going on here. I'll allow this to play through so that you can see how their relationship develops over the course of the play. I'll just pause it once, just towards the very end, so that I can explain to you what's going on at that point. Let me know if there are issues with the audio.
كلنا سواسية. أي سواسية؟ أي سواسية؟ هناك فروق شاسعة بيني وبينك. سأفعل. سوف أدخل يمن. أعذرني يا بني. هذه علتي. للأسف. وهذا سبب وجودي في هذه العيادة. وهذه نقطة مهمة. الفضفضة التي قلنا منها ولا نستطيع أن نطلقها من داخلنا. فأنا عجزت. أنا لا أستطيع أن أشارك أحد مشاكلي. لدي هموم واحتياجات خاصة. قطار العمر الذي يمضي ومن هذه المصطلحات القديمة التي ما زالت حاضرة. أرى وجهي كل يوم يذهب ولا زلت آنف. فكيف يكون الوضع إذا تزوجت وعشت مع رجل يلمسني كل يوم؟
Hennessey? Katherine?
Yes.
It's frozen. The video is frozen. We can't see it. Can you replay it, please?
Sure. Were you able to see part of it? Should I just go back? Okay. Let me actually try again. Okay. All right, can you all see that? It's not moving, I just have it paused.
Okay, now we can see it, yeah, but okay, let's see if it's gonna be frozen again.
I'll play the first 30 seconds or so and then I'll stop and you can tell me whether or not it's working.
Yes, please.
كيف لك أن تقولي عن شخص مؤمن متمسك بعقيدته أن يتركها من أجل الناس؟ ما لي ومال الناس؟ وجودك هنا من أجل الناس وإياك أن تنكر. أنا وأنت وهؤلاء كلنا سواسية.
أي سواسية؟ أي سواسية؟ هناك فروق شاسعة بيني وبينك.
How's that? Video and audio?
It's working, yeah.
Very good.
سوف أدخل يدي. اعذرني يا بني، فهذه علتي. وعلتك أن تشتم الناس؟ للأسف، وهذا سبب وجودي في هذه العيادة اليوم.
وهذه نقطة مهمة، الفضفضة التي حرمنا منها ولا نستطيع أن نطلقها من داخلنا. فأنا عن نفسي أنا لا أستطيع أن أشارك أحد مشاكلي، لدي هموم واحتياجات خاصة. قطار العمر الذي يمضي ومن هذه المصطلحات القديمة التي ما زالت حاضرة. آنسة، أرى وجهي كل يوم يزرق ولا زلت آنسة. فكيف يكون الوضع إذا تزوجت وعشت مع رجل يلمسني كل يوم؟
تخلص من وحدك وتعسى.
سأصلي لك وهذا الرباني يمحو عنك آلامك. ماذا؟ سأصلي لك.
لا شيء، وأنا سوف أقوم بالشيء نفسه، على الأقل دعائي مستجاب.
All right. Did the video work up until that point?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Very good. So you've seen now little clips from throughout the play of these two characters interacting. I'm just going to show you a scene from very, very close to the end. This is a point at which Jalil has asked Lara if it's possible for the two of them to perhaps see each other again, right after this unexpected meeting in the therapist's office.
أتمنى ذلك وأن يكون في مكان آخر.
وأن يكون معقرا.
بالتأكيد أن يكون معقرا. شكرا.
All right. And at this point, let me just come back to my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, can you all see that? Okay.
Yep.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the biggest technological hurdle that I hope we're going to face over the course of this presentation, and we have surmounted it. I just want to say thank you to my Syrian colleague, Abdul Qadir, for his assistance with some of the subtitles there. So I should bring to your attention the fact that this is actually an adaptation of a French script, but I think it's exceptionally well done in terms of its relevance to Gulf society. And I think it's very significant, not just given its willingness to tackle the subject of sectarianism head on, but also given the fact that mental illness is still stigmatized in certain quarters in the Gulf. It's a subject that people are reluctant to confront and to discuss. But in this play, we actually see different forms of mental illness being named and described. We see the very real challenges that these characters face as a result of their conditions. And we actually see a very hopeful ending in which they all come together to support each other and they all become friends. And I should note a kind of interesting observation about the casting here. The character in the yellow sweater, Lara, is played by an Iraqi actress named Ala Shakir. And she actually faced opposition from religiously conservative members of her family when she announced that she was going to embark upon a career in the theater. So I find it fascinating to see her playing a character here who argues with and eventually reaches a kind of mutual understanding, a friendship with a person whose religious views are very different. It's an example, if you like, of art imitating life. So the process of community formation that is modeled by this play actually relates to an argument that I made in 2018 in my book, Shakespeare on the Arabian Peninsula. And And that's that the fact that theater is a communal act is particularly significant in socially stratified contexts like ours, because it can bring together members of social groups that wouldn't normally have opportunities to interact with each other, all working together in the common aim of putting on a good show. And in doing so, they actually model for their audience members the benefits of working in a diverse and egalitarian community. It's a phenomenon that in the book I call new local theater. That is theater that kind of redefines people's understandings of the composition of the communities that they inhabit and who gets to be a part of those communities. So my second example is a play called Adda, meaning a bite. And this was performed as part of the Festival of Kuwaiti Comedy in 2019. So in this play, a dog enters a building site and lifts its leg on a construction worker. The worker is outraged, and a policeman is called in to investigate. And he vacillates between saying that the dog should be put down, that it should be killed, and blaming the construction worker for provoking the dog. And his attitude is based entirely on changing information provided by a group of bystanders as to who owns the dog, if it's a stray, or if it is the cherished pet of a prominent general, or perhaps the general's brother. So there's nearly an hour of verbal and physical comedy in this play. It prompted a lot of laughter amongst the audience members, particularly young children who were present the night that I saw it. But after all of that, the play rather unexpectedly ends in tragedy. The construction worker forgives the dog and actually comes to feel very affectionate towards it. But the general's brother denies owning it. And alone in a tight spotlight on the stage, the worker tearfully embraces the dog and laments that there's no place here for a dog if it's not the general's dog or the general's brother's dog. And at that point, a single gunshot reverberates through the sound system and the dog dies. For audiences in Kuwait, I think the message of this ending is crystal clear, right? This is about the widespread phenomenon of wasta, right? The catch-all term for various forms of nepotism, cronyism, clientelism that facilitate career advancement and wealth accumulation among the elite and well-connected, but which can wreak a grim and unjust havoc on the lives of those who are outside the circles of power. So the dog, of course, but also the construction worker who by the end would like to save the dog and is powerless to do so. This is a play that really has a remarkable emotional impact. I mean, if you take a look at this close-up from the previous photo, you'll see this dog is clearly a puppet, right? It is very obviously not a real animal, and yet, and it's manipulated very cleverly by this talented actor, Mustafa Mahmoud. But somehow the illusion of this, it draws us in the theater. So this is a script by Habiba al-Abdallah. It's actually inspired by a short story by the Russian writer Anton Chekhov, a story called The Chameleon. And it was directed by Habiba al-Abdallah's husband, Abdallah Turkmani. Now, at this point, I've actually shown you two works of theater that are adapted from, or in this case, inspired by works of literature from outside of the Gulf. So I just want to pause for a moment and consider the relationship between the phenomenon of adaptation and censorship. The late, great Egyptian theater critic Nihad Saleha once described censorship in the Gulf as burdening theater makers with, quote, a feeling of being incarcerated, besieged, and having to speak through metaphors and symbols. And the British Kuwaiti playwright Sulaiman al-Bassam talks about his adaptations of Shakespeare, noting that adaptation can provide playwrights with, quote, body armor against the censor's whip, right? So adaptation is actually one way that theater makers can evade censorship, right? Adaptations sometimes allow theater artists more freedom to say what they want to say than writing their own play might. But then, of course, we also have plays where they do just come right out and say it. And my third and final scene provides an interesting illustration of this. So right now you're looking at a photo from a performance of the play Al-Halas by Yemeni actor Abdul Khaliq Saif al-Jabri. And this was performed as part of the 2020 Yemeni Theater Festival, performed last year in the city of Mukalla, and sponsored in partnership between the Yemeni Ministry of Culture and the Sharjah Theater Authority. So some of you might know that the Emir of Sharjah is a staunch supporter of the theater. The Sharjah Theater Authority publishes numerous works, histories of theater, theatrical scripts, and the Emir himself has authored numerous plays. His government supports many of the most prominent Arabic language theater festivals and events in the region, like the Sharjah Theater Days Festival. So what we see in this play, in Al-Jabri's play, is a protagonist who is an author. In fact, he is a playwright. He writes works of theater, but he's forced to do so by a kind of cruel and intimidating master. So he has a problem on that side from, you know, this authority that is being imposed on him. And he also has very little authority himself because his characters are constantly failing to do what he tells them to do, right? They have a volition of their own, a will of their own. And he has a lot of very kind of, there are a lot of very erratic scenes in this play. I just want to focus on one, this one that you see in the photo. So we've got two guards and a prisoner. We've got some stylized costumes, which together with the names of these characters, Clarius, Arbius, and Decius, might actually kind of be suggestive of ancient Rome. But their dialogue makes clear that they are inspired less by ancient history and more by current events. Let me just show you some snippets from this script. You can see Arbius begins by commenting on war. The original Arabic of the script is on the right-hand side, a translation on the left. War, Arbius says, creates nothing but havoc and hatred. His guards are unmoved by this, but as you can see, his response is, you don't understand, my people are like the phoenix, right? The legendary bird that would burn itself to cinders and then rise from its own ashes. And then here is another set of dialogue from this script. Decius says, we came to support freedom, to which Arbius sarcastically responds with his holding up his bound hands in the air, and the way you've tied me up proves it, right? Decius tells him, we're not interested in having a debate with you. We are stronger and wealthier than you are. And Arbius says, but you don't have truth or right on your side, so you are going to lose. So I think that it's pretty obvious that what is happening here is a kind of commentary on the current military conflict in Yemen, right? Where Arbius is voicing the aspirations of the people of Yemen in front of his captors who become analogs for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, right? The belligerents, one side of the belligerents in this conflict. So, remarkable frankness for a play that was taking place under the auspices of an Emirati sponsor. But I would say the thing that is even more striking about this play is that it was just one out of 4 plays in the 6-play Festival of Yemeni Theater that included scenes with incarcerated characters that featured characters or action that basically took place inside a prison. So I've written a number of articles on the ways in which Yemeni theater serves as a social barometer. That is, it both reflects and it reflects upon the kind of prevailing Yemeni zeitgeist. So one way that we might interpret this particular scene is that this is a scene, and the other plays in the festival that feature prisoners as characters are staging the psychology of the populace of Yemen, right, who feel trapped and incarcerated by a military conflict that is continuing to drag on with no end in sight. In other words, Yemeni theater makers are using the character of the prisoner as a metaphor for their own existential state and that of their fellow citizens. But I think there is another interpretive possibility as well. It's at least possible that the choice to stage plays featuring prisoners was made as a response to and a form of protest against a specific set of current events. The reports, particularly from 2017 and 2018, of the abuse, torture, and forced disappearance of prisoners of war in the Yemeni conflict. So this is one of the ways in which we as audience members participate in the creation of a play's meaning. We get to decide whether we think a playwright and actors are sending the message, help us, we need to escape from our existential prison of war and despair, or whether we think they're trying to remind their audiences that real life prisoners should be treated humanely and should not be tortured or abused. I will actually leave you to ponder how you would interpret what these playwrights and actors are doing, but allow me to leave you with this final image. This photo here captures the moment when the audience erupted in spontaneous applause at Arbias's defiance of his captors and his insistence that Yemen would ultimately prevail in this conflict. So we see Arbias, he's raising the roof, the guards have broken character, they are laughing and applauding. It is a moment of collective rejoicing between the actors and their audience members at the idea that Yemen will eventually triumph over the challenges that currently besets their nation. So I hope these examples have given you some sense of the power and the potential of theater on the Arabian Peninsula, and of why I believe that when we talk about culture in this region, we have to take into consideration the communities and the meanings created by performances like these. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hennessey. Very interesting presentation. The floor is open now for questions. You're going to continue sharing your screen, Dr. Hennessey, or?
I'm happy to do this for at least a few minutes. I do like this. I like this image.
Okay, no problem. I need to check from my side how I can see the hands, or if, just 1 second.
If it's easier for you, I can stop.
Yeah, I think it would be easier, so I can basically check.
Okay, allow me to do that. Oh, I see some hands going up already. Fantastic.
Yeah. May I?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hennessey. My name is Nabila. You said that the last showpiece was performed in Sharjah, if I'm not mistaken. I know that the Qasmis of Sharjah are great sponsors of theater and culture altogether. But because of the political background, I'm pleasantly surprised, and I like it that such a display is possible over there, given the fact that they are a little bit tight-lipped on what is happening in Yemen. But it's really an interesting thing. I just want an assurance from you that this was performed in Sharjah.
No, it actually was not performed in Sharjah. As I said, it was actually performed in the Yemeni city of Mukalla, which is a coastal city in the Hadramaut. But it was sponsored by Sharjah.
Oh, even more interesting.
in partnership with the Yemeni government. Yes, so when I said this is remarkable frankness for a performance that is going on, under the auspices or with the support of the government of the Emir of Sharjah, yes, that I think is exactly to your point.
Very interesting, politically.
Yes. And if I may, that is one of the reasons that I love to watch what goes on the stage. I believe that in the Arabian Peninsula, what you see very often is political content that you would not find in other forums.
It's
Dr.
very
Mohsen? Dr. Mohsen, Dr. Bagneed?
Yes. Mohsen Bagneed from the business school. It's very, very interesting that it looks from your example in Yemen that there is less censorship of political dimensions in theaters than I'm familiar with. I'm very familiar with the Egyptian theater, which had extremely influence and reflect the local culture. But because of censorship, many players ended up people going to jail. But it looks to me from what you're saying that the theaters in the Gulf region is more liberal in terms of including political dimension. Does that applies to other countries in the Gulf region, or that's the one you looked at it in Yemen only?
That is an excellent question, Dr. Mohsen. Let me say that I am kind of struck by the rather ironic contrast between theater in the Gulf and Yemen with regards to censorship. I've always found it quite remarkable the degree of freedom that Yemeni actors and theater makers have to give voice to provocative thoughts and ideas on the stage. As a matter of fact, the only incidence of censorship in Yemen that I know of actually relates to an author whose work I've translated. He's more famous as a novelist, but really he's a wonderful writer, and his work for the theater, I think, deserves to be much better known. Wajdi al-Ahdal wrote a play called A Crime on Restaurant Street, and this was performed back in 2009. The main character in his play is a shadowy figure called the bank manager, and clearly the bank manager, from the way that he was described in the play, was a kind of figure for the president of Yemen at the time, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Political security in Yemen got wind of this, and they actually came to rehearsals. They tried to harass and intimidate the director, Amin Hazaber, and the actors. They demanded a copy of the script and so forth. But interestingly enough, they never actually demanded that the show be shut down. And so the response of those who were participating was simply, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't understand why you think this play would be problematic. And ultimately, political security left them alone, and they were able to go ahead and put on the play. And if you read it, it's actually available online, both in Arabic and in my English translation. I think it's very clear that there was reason for the president to, in fact, be concerned at the way that he was being portrayed in this play. But Yemen is a slightly different context, right? And Yemen is constantly beset by crises. So when you are dealing with combined threats of terrorism and religious extremism and a potential southern secession, budget deficits, declining water tables, all of these things, censoring what's going on in the theater is pretty low on your priority list. So I think that also factors in. Are we all still there?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think we have a question from Malik Muhammad.
Yes, Malik from English. Good to see you again, Catherine, and excellent presentation. For the like the political sensitivity of the issue, and the fact that it's whether it's staged in Sharjah or in Makalla, we know that political discourse is also theatrical, right? Even the politics of war involves a lot of role play. Everybody claims to be on the side of Yemen. So when the actors say Yemen will rise again, or Yemen will triumph, it could be the Yemen that the Saudis and the Emiratis are supporting, right? Just like there could be some other parties, Yemen. So it could be easily accommodated, right? And contained, whatever political message is being put out there. So I don't see that as a problem. Now, to go to the beginning of the presentation with the psychiatrist's office.
Actually, sorry, Malik, do you mind if before we move on, can I just comment?
Yeah.
First of all, lovely to hear your voice. I hope you're doing well. And secondly, yes, I would say plausible deniability is an important, that's an important concept to invoke here. But please go on, your question about Asarabia.
Yes, Asarabia, like in a region where theater is not sure of itself and you're always conscious of your craft, right? You would expect a lot of self-reflexivity, the metafictional part of the project to be on every, so every actor, every writer will be conscious of them doing theater. So the content will be self-reflexive in a way. Like I see like the different, and excuse whatever the term I use, whether you want to call it psychological disorders, is that the right term to use for the different cases we have in the office?
Well, these are all, yes, obsessive compulsive disorders.
Yeah, so in a way, they are theatrical too. The E. coli, like, for example, character, and this is the first time I hear this term, in a way is poetic, right? Repetition is poetic in a sense. The germaphobe could be the censor in a way. And censorship, like you said, could be a vehicle for creativity in a way, because it encourages creating metaphors. Isn't that what one critic said? Like, it's because of the censorship, we have a lot of metaphors and analogies and whatever, different methods of masking whatever you're trying to say. So it could be poetic too. And the, what was the third character? And I think it's the most kind of significant one.
Sammy who jumps around, Manal who repeats herself, Fuad with Tourette syndrome.
Yeah, and Tourette is unpredictable, right?
Absolutely.
Just like theater, you could just blur out anything, anytime, and you will catch the censor by surprise. Even the dog that breaks into the work station, that's like maybe some audience member jumping in, or some actor saying something out of not towing whatever line that was set for them. So the actor, the person with the mental illness, the pet, they're all kind of metaphors for whatever poetic, unpredictable thing out there that could be a danger, could be a risk that should be censored, but it's also kind of the venue for creativity and for maybe moments of enlightenment or truth, if there's such a thing. Anyway, thank you for a really interesting presentation, and yeah, those are just my 2 cents.
Malik, thank you so much. I think you've done something really, really useful for all of us. First of all, you've reminded me of one of the other reasons that I love theater, and that is because it is unpredictable. There is no telling exactly what's going to happen, right? Every performance is going to be a little bit different from the performance that went before, right? And that can happen as a result of accident or coincidence. That can also happen as a result of, you know, the audience's response, as I talked about. So yes, that is actually one of the kind of magical elements of theater, if you like. Its unexpected nature, its unpredictability. You're right that we do see that kind of unpredictability in all of these plays. But so that actually brings me then to the second intervention I think that you've made that is very useful, the idea that we can interpret these plays as commentary on the act of making theater itself. And I think that actually is, I think that's actually quite fascinating. Particularly, I don't want to spoil the ending of 4 o'clock for anyone, but particularly, I think if you watch it all the way to the end, you can see that there is a way very much in which you can interpret these characters as having been kind of, in a sense, directed without their knowledge to kind of form this support group for each other. So that is very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Katherine.
I think we have a question from Dr. Inas. Dr. Inas.
Yes, thank you, Fatma. Thank you, Dr. Katherine, for the interesting and informative presentation, and allow me to shift your attention to something different. Can you share with us, I know that at the AUK you've taught drama and you've taught Shakespeare courses, and I believe that you had your students perform some scenes. So I would like you to share with us something about your experience. How is teaching drama in the Gulf? What was the students' reaction? How did it go? Things that you would recommend for other colleagues interested in the same experience?
That is a lovely question, Dr. Inas. Thank you very much for that. I would say, first of all, I would recommend to anyone who has ever taught Shakespeare, or really anyone who has ever taught a work of drama, to not treat it as nothing more than a text, because works of drama are designed to be performed. They're designed to be read, they're designed to be staged, right? And so the text really is only one element in a whole panoply of elements that contribute to the meaning of a work of theater. With my students, as I see some of them are in the audience and they can tell you, I love to get them involved in actually performing works of theater. And what's interesting is that with a text like that of a Shakespeare play, a lot of times I will have students come to me at the beginning of the semester and they will say, I've read Shakespeare in high school, or, you know, I tried to read Hamlet, and it's just impossible. I can't get through the language. I don't understand what's being said, right? And Shakespeare's English is 400 years old. So of course there are going to be comprehension difficulties. But when I actually ask them to do a kind of impromptu reading in class, when we assign parts and everyone reads, or towards the end of the semester when I actually ask them to perform scenes, it is absolutely astonishing how much they understand, how much their fellow students understand just from kind of hearing the scenes performed. So I would say it's absolutely crucial if you're going to work with drama to actually, you know, work with it in the way that it is intended. That is, you know, turn it into a performance to the degree that that's possible. And I've been astonished by our students and the way that so many of them will throw themselves heart and soul into these performances. And without me requiring it, they will memorize lines, they will bring in props, they will design costumes, they will, you know, set a work to a piece of music that they think, you know, resonates with the dialogue. I actually had a young man in my Shakespeare class learn what's called original pronunciation. That is Elizabethan, the kind of Elizabethan pronunciation of English in order to deliver the to be or not to be speech from Hamlet at the end of my class the last time that we taught Shakespeare. It was amazing. Again, we've talked about student engagement quite a lot in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I've always defined it as when you see students, going above and beyond the requirements for an assignment, then you have it. And that's the sort of thing where I actually see an incredible amount of student engagement in performance. And performance is, I think, really an empowering practice. So I would encourage everyone to use it as much as possible.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Katherine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ina. So I think we're going to take one or two more questions. Dr. Ali?
Yes, thank you so much. Ali Al-Zu'bi from Science Department. Thank you, Dr. Katherine, for this nice presentation. I'm quite outside of your circle as artist, but as observer, let's say, I think everybody knows the very famous Kuwaiti play, Goodbye London, or Bye Bye London, yeah. It is called. Exactly. So although it is old, but it was really, really invading the whole all TV channels, of course, to many factors, sometimes political, sometimes the comedy style. But I wonder, through your research, can you tell us, for example, what is the reason for nowadays low impact of the theater in Gulf region on, let's say, Arab societies? Is it the new generations? I mean, they have different interests, or is it the technology? Yeah, nowadays maybe the people are interested in technology, or is it politics again? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. We will take one more question, and then we're going to go for a group photo. So, Dr. Salimi, go ahead.
I think Dr. Katherine is frozen up there.
Yeah.
Right?
Are you there, Dr. Hennessey?
I am here. Yes. Can you all hear me?
Sorry.
All right. So we're back on. Very good. Dr. Ali, I'm not sure if you heard me, but I did just want to say thank you for attending this lecture, despite the fact that it is out of your area of specialization. So yes, the status of theater, particularly in the Gulf, has changed quite a bit since the days of Abdul Hussein Abdul Rida and Bye Bye London. Now, we can attribute this to a number of factors. Certainly the rise of film and then television, and now streaming services like Netflix, right? And all of those actually make it quite easy to experience performance, right? Mm-hmm. Certainly much easier than finding out that a play is going on and purchasing a ticket if that's necessary, and then actually going to the designated venue at the designated time, right? All of which takes a certain amount of organization and resources and dedication, much more so than, finding something to watch on Netflix. So I think in certain ways, we might be tempted to attribute the difference to one of convenience, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think that is exactly, I don't think that's exactly true. There's a wonderful quotation from the Egyptian scholar Louis Awad. He points out that the ancient Egyptians actually had theater of their own more than 2 millennia before the ancient Greeks. But he says ancient Egyptian theater died and ancient Greek theater survives. And he attributes that to the fact that it was, ancient Egyptian theater was, it was related to religious practice. So there's this idea, as Moroccan scholar Khaled Amin points out, he says that, you know, ancient Egyptian theater was born and died in the temple. And I wonder sometimes if perhaps contemporary theater in the Gulf is born and also dies in the schools, meaning that for many students, the first time that they're introduced to drama is in elementary school. And certainly if we look at the history of theater in the Arabian Gulf and Yemen, we find that it begins as a scholastic pedagogical practice, right? It starts off as part of school activities. But I don't know that those of us, particularly those of us who work with literature, necessarily do as good a job as we could of documenting the importance of theater, of celebrating the importance of theater, and of pointing out to our students, to younger generations, that there is something that is very unique about live performance, right? About actually being there, as I've tried to stress in this lecture. And so, you know, I think it's actually really important that we make sure that contemporary theater on the Arabian Peninsula doesn't die in the schools, as it were, that it doesn't just become texts that people read, but that we engage with the way that they are, that theater practitioners are putting these texts on stage.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Before we go to the last question, if you are all comfortable with keeping your cameras on, maybe we can take some group photos, please. So I'll try to take some photos and then we're gonna continue just to make sure that it's working. I'll try it from my side. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, I think we're good. Dr. Salime, I think you have a question.
Dr. Katherine, first, thank you very much for your presentation, and also congratulations on the fellowship that you received. I hope our audience doesn't mind. I'm going to shift the topic a little bit away from theatre, but you did get a very prestigious grant, and there may be people in the audience who are interested in this. Do you have any guidelines, or do you want to run us through the process? Any tips that you may have for fellow colleagues or somebody else in the audience who would like to apply for such a grant?
Oh, that's an excellent question as well. So I would actually strongly encourage anyone who is working in the humanities to investigate the National Endowment for the humanities. Check the requirements, see if perhaps you have a project and if you fit the eligibility requirements. The application process, I would say, is relatively straightforward. It is somewhat demanding in terms of the documentation that they ask for. But really not perhaps as demanding as one might expect of a grant of its size in the humanities. And one of the best pieces of advice I think that I can give for anyone who is thinking of applying for this grant is, number one, do it, because even if your project is not selected, the National Endowment for the Humanities is one of the very few application processes that I know of that actually provides feedback on the project to applicants. Now it's anonymized, of course, so they don't tell you which scholars actually evaluated your project, but they do provide you with all of the comments from it ranges, I think, from 6 to 9 scholars who have been asked to look at the work that you are proposing. And so you can actually use that feedback, even if your application is not successful, in order to improve your application for, you know, a subsequent submission. And so, yeah, I would strongly encourage anyone who fits the eligibility requirements, you know, check and who has a humanities project that they would like to research, to first of all check the NEH website. And secondly, if you have any questions, please get in touch with me. I'd be happy to tell people about this in more detail. And third, really to go for it, because it's an application process that can provide benefit to you even if your application is not successful, you know, let's say the first time around.
Thank you, Dr. Katherine.
Thank you, Dr. Salimi. Do we have any more questions? Do we have any additional questions? I'll just take one more photo because the ones I took were not, I'll just take 2 additional photos, and then we're gonna wait to check if we still have additional questions. Okay, I think we're good. We're going to take the last question from Dr. Ghulam, our next speaker for next month. Dr. Ghulam, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hennessey, the question I have is the general one regarding the theater in the Middle East, in the Iranian, particularly Iranian and the Arab world, not so much in Turkish, the Ottoman Empire. Would you say that the concept of theater is a very modern concept in the Middle East? I mean, we have really become familiar with it since the 19th century. I mean, the modern type of Western theater. What we have had, at least in the case of the Shia world, the world of Shiism and Iran, it's been mostly the kind of theater that was in existence was, and still is related to religious subjects. You know, when it comes to mourning periods, you know, Muharram and so on. And it's all been related to Shiism and the Shia history. And it's interesting, you know, theatrics, but it's very different from the Western concept of, you know, theater, which is a whole learning educational process, you know, coming all the way from the ancient Greeks, particularly, you know, in the history of the West. So wouldn't you say that might be one reason why we don't see that much engagement in theater as you see in the West, in Europe and the United States?
That is really an excellent question. I would actually, so from my own perspective, I suspect that part of the reason that theater is not as prominent a part of the culture in the region, as personally I think it should be, has a lot to do with censorship. And I do actually believe that if the medium and the people who work within it, you know, if they felt that they were more free to express themselves, then I think people would take theater much more seriously, right? They would pay more attention to it. Unfortunately, because of the conditions of self-censorship, social censorship, official censorship, you know, I think it's actually, I think that tends to tame the medium in a way that, you know, that where it loses some of its power. Now, as I tried to point out in the presentation, that certainly that is not the case in Yemen. And I actually found Yemen to be a remarkable example of really powerful theater. And that was, at least in part, because Yemeni theater makers believe that theater is a means of educating people. And in Yemen, of course, where rates of illiteracy continue to be very high, there are people in society who don't have access to text-based literature, but who can go to the theater and who can understand a political discussion that is going on the stage. So that's actually, in Yemen, there is a different kind of view of the medium. It's really considered to be a medium that is used to educate the populace and to bring problems, socio-political problems, and potential solutions to those problems to people's attention. Iran honestly provides us with some really interesting examples of contemporary theater, at least as far as I understand it. You probably know much more about the theater scene in Iran than I do. But from what I've read, there's some really interesting politically engaged content, but again, content that needs to navigate that difficult conflict with censorship or potential repercussions, right, for provocative content.
But I do agree, but you know, it's mostly a medium that's very popular among the educated middle class and educated classes in the Iranian society. You know, it has appeal among them, and even the movies that are being made in Iran, which are very good, high quality, it's mostly sponsored by that group. And that's what I'm saying, when we look at the history, it's really a modern concept that makes meaning, that has meaning for the educated people, just like literature does, but you won't find it rooted in the grassroots of people. I'm very interested to find out that Yemen is different, but the fact is, you don't find people engaged, their lives being engaged in theater like you find in let's say, the British theater and so on. That's the point I'm trying to make. But in the modern day, yes, I mean, with the internet and the media we have, all of these tools are now becoming available to everybody. And you don't have to be educated now necessarily, college educated to like theater. You find it interesting. So the point of the history is a recent history. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, and that actually is a fair point, but dependent on basically how you define theater. So if you define theater as, modern theater as we understand it in like an American or a European context, then yes, the history is relatively recent, right? We find that type of theater on the Arabian Peninsula only from really 1910 onwards in Yemen, and then decades later in the Gulf countries. But it really, I would say, Dr. Ghulam, it is very dependent on how you define theater and performance, right? And I'm always struck by people saying, well, the Arab world didn't have theater before, say, 1910, or before, if we go back and look at the Egyptian and the Syro-Lebanese traditions in the 19th century. But there are performative traditions that exist and that go back centuries and really millennia in the Arab world. And so I think it's important to take those into account as well. It's important not to, discard or marginalize those simply because they don't correspond to our current idea of what theater looks like or should look like, right? Poetry, of course, is the kind of literary form par excellence in the across the Arab world, right? And I would argue that poetry that is publicly performed and recited constitutes a form of theater, right? So I think actually it's really important to keep that in mind. Where you start writing the history is very much dependent on how you are defining what theater actually is. So as Luis Awad says, we can actually go back to the ancient Egyptians if we want to look for examples of theater in in the Arab world.
So we're gonna take the very last and quick question from Dr. Khalid. Dr. Khalid, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katherine. A very interesting, indeed, presentation. I've been looking at and I've been reading, in my field about. I'm really interested in the development of institutions, especially in this region. I was just wondering if you've looked at whether the colonial history of this region has any effect on what we see in theater and in the arts today, and whether that, the Gulf region is different than, let's say, the Egyptian theater versus the other theaters that we see, if the colonial history has an impact on what we see.
That is a fantastic question, Dr. Khalid. Thank you very much. For that, I would have to say that a really good way or a really good place to start in terms of understanding how to conceive of theater as and its relationship to colonialism in the Arab and Islamic world is the work of Khalid Amin, who is a Moroccan scholar. His article, Theater in the Arab World, A Difficult Birth, I believe it's called. It is really excellent, I think, in terms of making a similar argument to the one that I was just going through with Dr. Ghulam, of really kind of reconceiving of Arab theater and Arabic language theater as a hybrid enterprise, right? And also I would say a transnational enterprise, right? One which is bringing together traditions from multiple languages, cultures, and, from various historical standpoints. In terms of the development of institutions, that's actually, this is fascinating. I have a chapter in my book that I can send you that's basically about how the rise of theater in Yemen and the Gulf coincides with the rise of the tertiary educational system. Right, so as I said, theater starts in schools, starts in elementary schools and secondary schools, but I think it's really once you have a university system in place in the Gulf and in Yemen that theater starts to flourish. So in terms of educational institutions, I think that is, that's one way of looking at the history. You can also look at material history, right? Who finances works of theater? What institutions exist in order to promote theater and to promote theater festivals? So something like the Sharjah Theater Authority is a really interesting institution to examine, particularly for the ways that they have been able to promote theater across a range of media. I mean, they produce, videos of performances that take place at their festivals. They publish theater histories and works of theater. They really provide a lot of platforms for theater artists who are working in the region. And so, that I would say is a unique institution here in the region, and it's one that has been incredibly important in helping to develop and document some of these traditions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Khalid. Thank you so much, Dr. Hennessey, for this excellent presentation. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this first event of the Faculty Speaker Series. We look forward to seeing you all in the next lecture with Dr. Ghulam next month. That's it for today. Thank you so much and have a nice evening.
And can I say before everyone goes, thank you all so much. I really have enjoyed both giving the presentation and responding to all of your questions. So many thanks for your engagement with this presentation, which I deeply appreciate.